Today we're going to talk about ecology, and ecology is my favorite part of biology. It's my field. It's the part that you study organisms or biological systems at higher levels of organization. So it kind of gives you a bigger picture of what's going on in an environment. Pretty much in ecology, we study the interactions between organisms and its physical environment. There are several levels within ecology. You could study an organism at the organismal level, but not necessarily looking at its organs and anatomy and physiology, but really like how that organism interacts with its environment. We can study at a little higher level from that would be population ecology, which is when you study all the organisms that belong to the same species that live in the same place at the same time. Remember that that's the level that we talk about evolution, but we're going to see next class that understanding how populations grow and shrink like will help us understand their dynamics. And above population is what we call community ecology, which will be populations of different species coexisting in a single environment. So a community ecologist would be looking at interactions between these species, who eats whom collaborates with whom, and things like that. Higher than community ecology, a higher level would be ecosystem ecology, which would be when scientists study the interactions between the organisms and their physical environment. Okay, so you're going to look at this community here, but now as an ecosystem ecologist, you wouldn't be interested in how they interact with each other, but more how the amount of nutrients in this area affect the different populations, how the energy, how the amount of light, water, so all the physical aspects of the environment, how do they influence the dynamics of this community. Above ecosystem, then we can also study at the landscape level, which would be like looking at a bigger area and kind of seeing the interaction among different ecosystems. And of course, you could also like look at global level interactions of species and their environment and what we would call global ecology. So that's where you would study climate change, for example, right? So things that are going to affect the whole world. One of the things that we look at is the distribution of these species and communities and ecosystems. And physical aspects are going to influence that. One of them, major ones, is climate. And climate is pretty much like this long-term kind of weather conditions, right? So at the long term, what is the usual pattern of weather you find in a place, and that would be the climate. Most of the variation in climate that we see on Earth, if you look here in this diagram, this is Earth, is given by the way the rays of the sun actually hit Earth. So if you imagine like these are the rays of the sun here in yellow, these kind of horizontal lines. The sun is so big, right, that this light is hitting Earth at this straight angle. But because Earth has this slope, or this is round, so it's not like a flat surface. If you were a flat surface, every part of the Earth would receive the same amount of light. But because it's not, it has this curve, each area of the Earth is going to receive a different amount of light. So if you look at the equator, for example, so this kind of incoming sunlight right here at the equator, you see that the equator is going to get that amount of sunlight. Notice that these are all kind of the same width, these kind of rays of sunlight. And you notice that it's going to get that same width, right, in the area. Because at this level right here of the equator, there isn't much of a curve on Earth. But if you look as you kind of go towards the poles, you see because of that angle, the same amount of sunlight is now hitting a larger area. So larger here at around in the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. And when you get closer and closer to the North Pole, you see that the area that same amount of sunlight is hitting is much wider. Look, it kind of hits over a wider area, meaning that here at the equator, those rays of sunlight are concentrated in one area. So it receives a lot more heat. Okay, so if you imagine like in terms of energy per area, it receives more energy at the equator. Whereas at the poles, it's receiving very, very little energy per area because it's so spread apart. So this is going to give changes in the climate of these areas, right? That's why like the poles are going to be super cold because they're getting per square mile, they're getting like very, very little sunlight. So this is because it's going to influence heat on Earth, the way kind of Earth heats and heats differentially in each area. It's going to influence the patterns of air circulation. I like to look at first at this diagram on the right here. And if you look at this diagram, it's just like a little piece of this part of the earth, okay, and it blows up. So you can see like the equator is down here, which is here at 0 degrees latitude, and it gets a little bit at 30 degrees north. So what happens is this: remember that the equator, so 0 degrees here, was getting a lot of energy from sunlight, right? It was all concentrated in a small area. So per square mile, square kilometer, the equator receives way more solar energy than any other area of the earth. And because of that, it will heat more than the other areas of the earth. And when it heats more, remember that air rises, right? So hot air is going to rise. So because the surface of the earth is heating up, the air above it is going to rise. Do you see this is the surface of the earth? This will be the atmosphere. So you're seeing kind of sideways. So imagine like it heats up here and then the air rises. Well, when the air rises, okay, so it's going to release moisture. Okay, so that's why it rains a lot in the equator. And then that air is going to move to cooler areas. Okay, so that's what it's going to do. So it's going to rise and then move to cooler areas away from the equator. Because it released moisture here, now this air is dry. It's getting drier and drier and drier. When it gets to an area that is cooler, it's going to descend. When it descends, now this air is super dry, it's going to create a really dry area around here. And then it will move in to replace that warm air that rose here in the equator, and it's going to replace it and then gather moisture along the way and then go up, rise again, and then release that moisture. It happens that this area of descent, dry air descent, is at around 30 degrees north latitude. So what happens at this level, 30 degrees north and south, so it happens both, okay, it happens on the north and it happens on the south, same way. These are areas of like really, really dry ecosystems and dry environments. And you see it because the air circulates in this way, it creates these patterns of circulation that we see. So this kind of differential humidity, right? So very, very wet equator, and at around 30 degrees north and south, you have areas of really, really dry air. It's going to cause a difference in the biomes that are going to exist in these areas. In the area of the equator, we have the tropics, right? So where you have like warm and very, very wet year round, right? Because you have all that moist air rising and the heat, right, from the sun. And at the 30 degrees latitude, both north and south, notice this pink biome here. And if you look at pink, pink is desert. So notice how deserts are common in this area. That's why you're going to find mostly dry biomes at this level because of that air circulation pattern. And it happens that Florida is at around 30 degrees north. So Florida was supposed to be a desert. However, because Florida is so small and it's a peninsula and surrounded by water, the ocean kind of makes its climate more mild. So we have a lot of moisture from the ocean that's going to contribute to not producing a desert right here. Let's take a look at the different biomes and their distribution. And you see that their distribution kind of follow a pattern, right? As I pointed out. If you look at the poles, well, you're going to have either polar ice, or when you start having vegetation, which would be this kind of lavender color, like light lavender color here, you have a biome called tundra, which is extremely cold, mostly snow all the time. We'll have a very, very short summer when things are not frozen, so like plants are going to grow really, really fast, complete its cycle like within weeks or even few months, and then be winter again and then all frozen. Then you have coming down, so from pole towards equator. Below that, you're going to find like coniferous forests. This kind of dark green here are coniferous forests, which are forests now, but they're dominated by pines and gymnosperms, pretty much, conifers, which can withstand a lot of snow, so that they're really well adapted to a very cold environment. However, the growing season is longer, so it allows for those trees to develop. Then coming down, we have temperate broadleaf forest, which is this kind of blue-green color right here. You also see some, which will be like also forest, but now dominated by angiosperms. Here then you have grasslands, so these here will be like temperate grasslands, like prairies, dominated by grasses, as the name suggests. Then you have kind of deserts. You do have this kind of chaparral, which is this kind of reddish color ones. They're kind of shrubby vegetation that occurs in Mediterranean type of climate when you have like a dry summer and a wet winter. Then you have the savannas, which would be kind of the grasslands, the tropical grasslands, pretty much. The tropical forests in light green. What else? Mountains. You have mountains here in purple. And that's it. So you see this is kind of more or less a distribution of biomes. So of terrestrial biomes. If you take two main factors that affect the the existence or the location and distribution of these biomes, we can actually differentiate them by these two factors. So let's take temperature and precipitation, which would be a measure of humidity. You see they almost don't overlap. I mean, they do overlap a little bit, but you see that there is a kind of nice distribution through them. Let's look at this kind of more obvious one, like the desert. Look at the desert. It's very, very low precipitation, right? So it kind of is all the way on the left of this graph right here. But it has a kind of wide range of temperatures. So here's mean annual temperature. And I'm imagining it's the mean high and the mean low. And you can see kind of that a desert is not always hot. On the contrary, actually, there is a huge oscillation between day and night. The nights are cold, the days are hot, the winters are cold, and the summers are hot. So there's an oscillation in temperature there, but extremely dry. It's the driest one of them all. Then you have temperate grasslands, which are also dryish, dry, right? But not as dry as desert, and also have a high oscillation of temperature, day night, and also summer winter. The tundra will be one that has also low precipitation rate, but different from desert and grasslands, it has very, very low temperature. So here's the mean annual temperature. Even though it has a kind of somewhat of an oscillation, you see that kind of the high is kind of less, around 5 degrees Celsius, which is really low, like zero is freezing, right? Then you have these two here, which kind of have a similar range in precipitation, but they kind of differ in the temperature range that they can kind of occur. If it's a lower temperature range, you're going to find that it's going to form coniferous forests. If it is a little higher, you see broadleaf forests forming. And then finally, you have tropical forests, which has a very interesting distribution in terms of precipitation and temperature. Notice that it has a very wide oscillation in terms of precipitation. Usually they have like a dry season and a wet season. That's usually how it's separated in tropical forests. But look at the annual temperature. It almost doesn't vary at all. And that's why kind of it allows such high diversity of organisms to exist in this area, because there's very little oscillation in terms of temperature. Those were terrestrial biomes. Let's take a look at examples of aquatic biomes. So lakes are an aquatic biome. Water completely surrounded by land. Wetlands are pretty much lakes that are vegetated. So it will be like areas in which the soil is at least close to saturation, if not oversaturated. So it doesn't need to be flooded to be a wetland, but it's an area in which the soil is almost close to saturation all the time. Rivers and streams are going to be areas of flowing water, right? So going from a source to the ocean or to another river. Estuaries, extremely important here in Florida. Estuaries are biomes that occur when fresh water, so if you look here, this is Tampa Bay. So imagine like all the rivers that kind of flow into Tampa Bay, they're going to bring fresh water into this area. However, it's right by the ocean. So there is this area here is going to be a mix of salt and fresh water, which we call estuaries. So that's what estuaries are. All along the coast of Florida, Tampa Bay, so this whole area is going to be estuaries. And you're going to see things like mangroves and seagrasses growing in these areas. From the ocean side, you have intertidal zones, which will be, as the name suggests, the zones between the tides, between the low and the high tide. If it is a rocky environment, you may find like tide pools in this area, or here in Florida, usually we find like sandy. But you're going to have a community, a certain suite of species that live in this area. Could be like inside of the sand, but they're living in that intertidal zone. Also, you have the open ocean, which we call it the pelagic zone. So just the open ocean. Coral reefs, extremely important. They are considered the tropical forests of the ocean and they also occur like in warm areas with very, very clear water. Okay, they need clear water because the base is corals, right? And the corals, remember, they have a symbiotic relationship with a dinoflagellate, which is photosynthetic. So corals need clear water in order to exist, so enough light can get to them, and the dinoflagellates can photosynthesize and allow the coral to thrive. Finally, another example of aquatic biome is what we call the benthic zone. And benthic or benthos refers to the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't need to be deep, deep, deep. So in this case here, I have an example of very, very deep community of organisms. These are marine worms. They're polychaetes. and they form the community or part of the community of hydrothermal vents, which are these little vents in which you have like geothermal energy coming out that occur in really, really deep areas of the ocean. But benthic zone does not mean super, super deep. Okay, it just means the bottom of the ocean. If it is a shallow area, that bottom is going to be low depth. But if it is like very, very deep areas of the ocean, it's going to be the deep, deep, deep ocean. So this is it for an introduction for ecology. Next class we'll start talking about populations and then communities and ecosystems.